tax fraud as well. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Considerable debate going on in this House as to whether or not more resource is applied in the recovery of tax fraud or even debt versus welfare fraud or debt. Now, of course, the scale of one is significant versus the scale of the other. Of course, anyone who's in employment is covered by PAYE. More people have contact with tax requirements than would with welfare payments. But even taking that into account, scale in and of itself actually justifies why we should be putting significant resource into ensuring that everyone is paying their dues when it comes to tax. But the point has even then been made by Dr. Merritt from Victoria University that more, quote, I'm quoting from her here, more resources were applied to collecting welfare debt than tax debt. That statement again, after the comparative work she has been done between the two, more resources were applied to collecting welfare debt than tax debt. Now, as much as the government wants to claim that that is not the case, that is what was produced by the work of Victoria University. So not only do we know that the scale is larger, we also know that the penalties you're likely to incur are going to be higher. For instance, you're more likely to get a custodial sentence if you're convicted of welfare fraud than if you're convicted of tax fraud, even though on average tax fraud where a custodial sentence is being applied amounts to roughly $800,000 versus $67,000 when it comes to welfare. There is inequity in our system right down to the amount of resource applied in recovering debt. And we should all be interested and concerned by that. All fraud is wrong. All fraud in some way affects taxpayers because it's all coming from the collective pie. All of it should be pursued. But that's what we're highlighting, Mr Chair, all of it, and with equal vigour. And our point is that it appears that not only is there a disparity, but actually the penalties that apply are different. The degree to which you will get some kind of discounting on arrears is likely to be different, and none of that strikes us as being fair. For instance, Mr Chair, and we are discussing in part 2, some of the ways in which MSD has the ability to recover debt. We know, though, that a taxpayer can apply for financial relief via IRD. You'll find that is rarely the case when it comes to welfare, and I want to add overpayment, not just fraud, but overpayment, because that is a frequent occurrence in our system, that the ability to seek financial relief, it's somewhat limited. You'll be paying down regardless of the amount that you owe. There will be a deduction almost always applied if there's an overpayment directly from the next benefit payment you receive. When your discretionary income is incredibly low, that has a significant impact. And I'm not just talking about fraud here, I'm talking about recovery sometimes of MSD's own mistakes. Because as the my Green Party colleagues have pointed out, overpayment often occurs without any mischievousness on the part of the beneficiary, simply because of the way our system works. And let me talk to that point briefly. We know that actually many of the recipients of welfare payments in this country are working, but they simply do not earn enough to survive. They might be in precarious work, working a few hours a week, which is then topped up by MSD. They might have a job that 1 week there's work and 1 week there's not. Many of us will have seen cases like this before. In those cases, an individual is required at the end of the week on a Friday to call into Work and Income on the phone line, report in how many hours they have worked. Now, obviously, anyone who's worked on a payslip system, when I was back in the old supermarket, there was a delay. You wouldn't get your payslip on how many hours you'd worked that week and what your pay was until some time after. So we're requiring Work and Income clients to make a best guess of what the hours that they perceive that they worked. So they call that in, Mr Chair, to work and income. Now, Mr Chair, this does, as you can imagine, lead to some potential discrepancy. And that, Mr Chair,
Jacinda Ardern,
I believe was the reason that when IRD and MSD recently started sharing information, you suddenly see this increase in what they determine to be discrepancies. Discrepancies is a word I want to highlight, Mr Chair. It was at that time presented by the government as being them having discovered all of this new fraud in the system. Not so. Simply what they discovered was the inefficiency of our own systems. That someone who calls through and says, I believe I worked 6 hours, actually may have worked 7. They may have worked 5, but that extra hour was not counted, not registered overtime. Discrepancies like that are not an uncommon thing. They're not deliberately fraudulent. They're just different errors, perhaps, in even payroll's part. But it all shows up as something that then needs to be, if a calculation is based on those hours, either the recipient will either need to be topped up if there was an inaccuracy or pay something back, and it happens. When that, however, is calculated, that's get lumped into overpayment and is then deducted from the beneficiary's future payments. So you can see how this occurs, Mr Chair, and it all gets lumped in together. Now, when that happens, people pay it back. That's how the system works. But there is often little relief when it's through no fault of their own. They are having these deductions made to what is very small discretionary income. If we jump then to when they're overpaying, where it might have paying back where it might have been more deliberate. There was some discussion at Select Committee over the consideration, as I said earlier, that the Chief Executive makes when determining the level at which someone's paying that back or whether or not there are any special circumstances involved. Now, they are required to determine the payment rate and whether or not any financial hardship will result, but there's still very little leeway there. Now, that's not to say the debt shouldn't be recovered, simply that we think common sense should apply, and that if someone in the process of paying back their debt is left in a position where they can't survive, well, that serves no one at the end of the day. So we do have some differences in the level of discretion, the quite liberal way that IRD is able to determine leniency in that regard to the much more rigid approach that MSD is required to take. And that probably explains why you're seeing greater write-off of arrears in our IRD system than you are in our MSD system. The one last thing that I want to come to, and I also want to touch on part 2, Mr Chair, equally, and this was pointed out in Victoria University's research as well, MSD can recover from delayed redundancy, retirement payments, compensation, damages, basically anything. If you get any form of income, even if they have to wait a number of years, they will then be able to recover the debt from that place. Now, we can debate whether or not that's right or wrong. My question simply is this: does IRD have that same power? Simple question. Because if we're doing it here, it should apply to that system as well. One final point I wish to make, Mr Chair. We haven't discussed this in great detail, but this bill also changes the ability of MSD in its investigations to conduct a thorough investigation without first informing the accused. Now, that might seem like a strange thing to do. Why would MSD tell someone they were being investigated? Well, for the very simple reason that some people sometimes report in beneficiaries for vexatious reasons, for mischievous reasons. We know it happens. That probably explains why in 2010 of the 16,000 allegations of benefit fraud, 2,000 resulted in a debt and 14% of those were found to have warranted prosecution. So quite small proportions when you look at how many allegations are being made, Mr Speaker. So why would we want to then remove one of our mechanisms to determine actually whether or not something mischievous is occurring? If you ask the questions of the individual, sometimes there are entirely plausible explanations, and that's where it ends. but instead we're allowing resource to go into an investigation that actually may not be required, not to mention the privacy issues that that come with it, and the ability to even undermine someone's employment by going straight to an employer in an investigation rather than the individual accused.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this committee.